The stagecoach robbery happened so fast that Sarah McKenna barely had time to register the gunshots before her father slumped against her shoulder, blood blooming across his chest like a crimson flower in the New Mexico dust. It was August 1878, and the sun beat down mercilessly on the overturned coach as masked men rifled through luggage and pockets, their laughter cutting through her shock like broken glass. She pressed her hands against her father's wound, feeling his life slip away beneath her trembling fingers, and when the outlaws finally rode off in clouds of desert sand, she was left alone with his body and the dying groans of the driver who would not last the hour. At 17, Sarah had been traveling to her aunt's ranch in Silver City, but now she found herself orphaned on a desolate stretch of road with nothing but the clothes on her back and a future that had shattered like mirror glass. 3 years later, Sarah McKenna was no longer the delicate girl who had watched her father die. Her hands, once soft and accustomed to piano keys and embroidery needles, had transformed into something else entirely. The calluses were thick across her palms, built up from years of handling reins, pitchforks, and the rough wooden handles of water buckets. Her aunt had died within 6 months of Sarah's arrival, leaving her the small ranch that barely scraped by. And Sarah had learned quickly that survival in the New Mexico territory meant shedding every notion of femininity she had once held dear. She broke horses, mended fences, hauled hay, and did the work of 3 men because she had no choice. The neighboring ranchers looked at her with a mixture of pity and respect, but none offered marriage. Who would want a woman who smelled of horse sweat and whose hands were rougher than most men's? The summer of 1881 brought a drought that threatened to break even the strongest ranchers. Sarah's water supply had dwindled to almost nothing, and her small herd of cattle were growing gaunt. She was in town, trying to negotiate credit at the general store, when she first heard about the cowboy who had taken work at the massive Double R ranch that bordered her property to the north. His name was James Cordell, and according to the gossip that flowed as freely as whiskey in Silver City, he was originally from Texas, had worked cattle drives from San Antonio to Kansas, and possessed an uncanny ability with horses that bordered on magical. Sarah paid little attention to the talk. Cowboys came and went like tumbleweeds, and she had learned not to depend on anyone but herself. Their first meeting happened on a scorching afternoon when Sarah found one of her young steers tangled in barbed wire on what she thought was still her land. She was struggling to free the panicked animal, her hands already bleeding from the wire's cruel barbs when a shadow fell across her. She looked up to find a man sitting astride a beautiful paint horse, his hat pulled low against the sun. He was tall. She could tell even mounted, with broad shoulders and the easy posture of someone who had spent more time in a saddle than on solid ground. "That's Double R land you're on," he said, his voice a low drawl that carried a hint of Texas heat. Sarah's jaw tightened. "This is my land, has been for 3 years." The cowboy dismounted in one fluid motion, and Sarah found herself looking up at him. He was perhaps 24 or 25, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of strong coffee. A scar traced a thin line along his jaw, and his hands, she noticed as he approached, were large and capable. "Survey says different, but that doesn't matter right now. Your steer's about to break his fool neck." Without waiting for permission, James moved past her and began working the wire with practiced efficiency. Sarah bristled at the presumption, but couldn't deny she needed the help. Together they freed the animal, and it bolted away with an indignant bellow. Sarah stood there, breathing hard, her hands throbbing. Blood dripped from her palms where the wire had cut deep. James caught her wrist before she could pull away, turning her hand palm up. His touch was surprisingly gentle for such a large man. "You need to clean these." "I'll manage," Sarah said, trying to tug free. His grip didn't tighten, but he didn't release her either. "I'm sure you will. You look like you manage everything." His eyes met hers, and there was no mockery in them, only a steady assessment that made her feel suddenly exposed. "But infection out here can kill you just as sure as a bullet." Sarah's throat felt tight. She hadn't been this close to a man in 3 years, and the warmth of his hand around her wrist sent an unfamiliar flutter through her chest. "Fine. I'll clean them when I get home." He released her then, stepping back to give her space. "James Cordell. I'm foreman at the Double R now. Sarah McKenna." She mounted her horse awkwardly, her cut hands making the motion clumsy. "And this is still my land, Mr. Cordell." His mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "We'll see about that, Miss McKenna." She rode away feeling his gaze on her back, and she hated how aware she was of it. The land dispute became apparent quickly. The Double R's owner, a wealthy businessman from St. Louis named Herbert Reynolds, claimed that Sarah's aunt had never properly filed the deed to the eastern 20 acres, which included the only reliable water source for miles. Sarah spent her meager savings on a lawyer in town, only to be told that the records were murky at best. Without clear documentation and with Reynolds's money and influence, she would likely lose the land. James Cordell appeared at her ranch 3 days later, riding up at sunset when the sky was painted in shades of orange and purple that seemed too beautiful for the desperation Sarah felt. She was sitting on her porch, her bandaged hands resting on her knees, contemplating a future that seemed to grow bleaker by the hour. "Came to talk," James said, dismounting and tying his horse to the rail without invitation. "If you're here to offer me money to leave, you can save your breath." He climbed the 2 steps to the porch and leaned against the post, crossing his arms. "Not here for that. Came to tell you that I've been looking at the old survey maps. Your aunt's claim is legitimate. The markers are still there if you know where to look." Sarah's head snapped up. "Why would you tell me that? You work for Reynolds." "I work for whoever pays me," James said evenly, "but I don't work for thieves. Reynolds knew about those markers. He's hoping you don't." "Why help me?" Suspicion colored every word. In Sarah's experience, people didn't help without expecting something in return. James was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting across her small ranch, the weathered barn, the modest house that needed paint, the corrals that held her small herd. "My mother had a place like this after my father died. Ranch hands and neighbors kept circling, waiting for her to fail so they could swoop in and take what was hers. She held on for 5 years before exhaustion took her." His jaw tightened. "I was 15 and couldn't help her. Watching you reminds me of her. Stubborn, proud, too damn independent for your own good." The words should have offended her, but the raw honesty in his voice stripped away her defenses. "I can't pay you for the information." "Didn't ask you to." He pushed off from the post. "But you'll need someone to testify about those markers. I'll do it." "Reynolds will fire you." "Probably." James smiled then, a real smile that transformed his serious face into something almost boyish. "Good thing there's always work for a decent hand." Sarah stood, her bandaged hands clenching at her sides. "Why do this for me? You don't know me." James's eyes met hers, and the intensity in them made her breath catch. "Maybe I'd like to." He left before she could formulate a response, riding off into the gathering darkness while Sarah stood on her porch, her heart beating in a rhythm it had forgotten. The hearing at the territorial courthouse took place on a sweltering morning in late August. Sarah wore her only decent dress, a simple calico that had belonged to her aunt, and tried to ignore how shabby she felt next to Reynolds's expensive suit and gold watch chain. James appeared just as the proceedings were about to begin, no longer dressed in his working clothes but in clean trousers and a pressed shirt that emphasized his broad shoulders. He had indeed been fired, Sarah learned, but he testified clearly and without embellishment about the original survey markers and Reynolds's knowledge of them. The judge, a weathered man named Harrison, who had presided over land disputes for 20 years, ruled in Sarah's favor. The eastern 20 acres, including the water rights, belonged to her. Reynolds stormed out of the courthouse with threats of appeal, but his lawyer quietly advised Sarah afterward that the man wouldn't pursue it. The ruling was too clear. Sarah found James on the courthouse steps, settling his hat on his head. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling inadequate. "I don't know how to repay you." "No need." He started down the steps, and panic fluttered in Sarah's chest. "Wait!" She hurried after him, catching his arm. He turned, surprise flickering across his face. "You need work. I need help with the ranch. I can't pay much, but there's a cabin on the property that needs some fixing up, and I can manage meals and a small wage." James studied her for a long moment, and Sarah became acutely aware of her rough hands, her sun-darkened skin, her complete lack of anything resembling feminine charm. What man would want to work for a woman who could barely offer coffee without burning it? "All right," James said finally, "I'll take the job." Relief flooded through her so powerfully that her knees felt weak. Good. That's good. They rode back to her ranch in companionable silence, and Sarah tried not to think about how right it felt to have him beside her. The cabin James moved into had been used for storage, and it took 2 full days of work to make it habitable. Sarah helped when her own chores allowed, and she found herself watching him more than she should, noticing the efficient way he moved, the quiet competence of everything he did. He was different from the ranch hands she had known, more thoughtful, less given to empty boasting. When he spoke, it was worth hearing. By the end of the first week, a routine had established itself. James handled the heavier work, the fence repairs and horse breaking and cattle management that Sarah had struggled with alone. She managed the house, the chickens, the garden, and the endless cooking that feeding 2 people required. They ate dinner together on her porch as the sun set, talking about the day's work, about weather patterns and cattle prices and the small details of ranch life. James never pushed for more personal conversation, but gradually, like water finding cracks in stone, their stories began to emerge. Sarah told him about her father, about watching him die and being unable to save him. She told him about her aunt, gruff and hard but ultimately kind, who had taught her how to survive in this harsh land. She told him about the loneliness, the way she had hardened herself against it because softness was a luxury she couldn't afford. James spoke of Texas, of growing up poor on a struggling ranch, of his mother's death, and his years drifting from job to job, learning everything he could about horses and cattle. He had been in Kansas, Oklahoma Territory, Colorado, always moving, never settling because nowhere felt like home. "Why stay here?" Sarah asked one evening as they watched the stars emerge in the vast New Mexico sky. James was quiet, rolling a blade of grass between his fingers. "Maybe I'm tired of drifting, or maybe I found something worth staying for." His eyes met hers and Sarah's breath caught. The air between them felt charged, heavy with possibility and fear. She looked away first, her scarred hands twisting in her lap. The days grew shorter as September arrived, bringing slightly cooler temperatures and the constant work of preparing for winter. Sarah and James worked side by side, their partnership growing more seamless with each passing day. He anticipated her needs before she spoke them, and she learned to read his silences, understanding when he needed space and when he welcomed company. But Sarah felt the growing attraction between them like a physical ache, and it terrified her. She had built walls around her heart so high and thick that she didn't know how to dismantle them. More than that, she couldn't imagine why a man like James, capable and strong and quietly handsome, would want a woman like her. Her hands were a constant reminder of what she had become, rough and calloused, scarred from work and wire, and the endless demands of survival. The crisis came on a cool October morning when one of Sarah's mares decided to foal early. The birth was complicated, and Sarah found herself shoulder-deep in blood and fluid, trying to reposition the foal while James held the panicking mare steady. It took 2 hours of exhausting work, but finally the foal slipped free, wet and perfect, and the mare began her instinctive cleaning. Sarah sat back in the straw, her arms trembling from exertion, her clothes ruined. James knelt beside her, his own shirt stained, and his face showing the strain of the morning. "You did good," he said quietly. "We did good," Sarah corrected, too tired to maintain her usual guard. "I couldn't have managed without you." James reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek. The gentleness of the gesture made Sarah's eyes sting with unexpected tears. "I should clean up," she said, standing quickly and nearly stumbling in her haste to escape. She made it to the pump behind the house before the tears came in earnest. She was scrubbing her hands furiously, watching the blood and birth matter swirl away in the water, when James appeared beside her. He didn't speak, just took the harsh soap from her and began washing her hands himself, his large fingers gentle against her work-roughened palms. "My hands are too rough for a lady," Sarah said, the words breaking on a sob she couldn't contain. "Look at them. I'm not soft anymore. I'm not anything a man would want." James lifted her hands, still dripping water, and studied them in the morning light. Then, deliberately, he brought her right palm to his lips and kissed it. The gesture was so tender, so reverent, that Sarah's breath stopped. He kissed her left palm next, his lips warm against her calloused skin. "These hands built a life," James said, his voice rough with emotion. "These hands saved that foal. These hands hold this ranch together against every obstacle this land throws at you. These hands are beautiful, Sarah. You're beautiful." "I'm not," Sarah whispered, but her resistance was crumbling. "You are." James cupped her face in his own rough hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. "You're the strongest, most remarkable woman I've ever known. Your hands aren't too rough. They're perfect. They're honest. They show exactly who you are, and who you are is someone I've fallen in love with." The words hung in the air between them, impossible and perfect. "You can't," Sarah said weakly. "You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying. I've been in love with you since that first day when you stood your ground about your land, bleeding and stubborn and too proud to ask for help." His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, catching a tear. "I love you, Sarah McKenna. Every rough, difficult, beautiful inch of you." Sarah's walls, so carefully constructed over 3 long years, shattered completely. She surged forward, wrapping her arms around his neck, and James caught her, holding her as she cried against his chest. All the loneliness, all the fear, all the desperate determination that had kept her upright came pouring out in racking sobs that left her weak and spent. James held her through it all, one hand stroking her hair, murmuring nonsense words of comfort. When the storm finally passed, Sarah pulled back enough to look up at him. "I don't know how to be soft," she admitted. "I don't know how to be what a wife should be." "Then don't be." James smiled, that transforming smile that made her heart skip. "Be exactly who you are. That's all I want." Sarah kissed him then, a clumsy, inexperienced kiss that he returned with patience and growing heat. His lips were warm and firm, and when his arms tightened around her, Sarah felt something unlock in her chest, a space she hadn't known was frozen, beginning to thaw. They stood behind the house for long minutes, learning each other through kisses and touches, until the sound of the new foal's whinny reminded them of responsibilities still waiting. James pulled back, his breathing unsteady, his eyes dark with desire. "We should talk about this properly." "Yes," Sarah agreed, though she made no move to step away from the circle of his arms. "I want to marry you," James said bluntly. "I don't have much to offer except hard work and a stubborn nature that probably matches yours, but I love you, and I'll spend every day proving it if you'll have me." Sarah's heart, that organ she had thought permanently scarred, swelled with a joy so intense it was almost painful. "Yes," she said, the words simple and absolute. "Yes, I'll marry you." James kissed her again, deeper this time, and Sarah let herself fall into it, into him, into the terrifying and wonderful vulnerability of being loved. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Silver City. Sarah wore a new dress, her first in years, a soft blue that James had insisted on buying despite her protests. Her hands, scrubbed clean but still bearing their calluses and scars, trembled as James slipped a simple gold band onto her finger. His own hands shook as she did the same for him. The minister pronounced them husband and wife, and when James kissed her, Sarah felt the last of her protective armor fall away. She was vulnerable now, open in a way that terrified her, but looking into her husband's eyes, she found she didn't regret it. They spent their wedding night in the ranch house that was now truly theirs together. James was patient and gentle, mindful of Sarah's inexperience, and when he made love to her, he worshipped every inch of her sun-darkened skin, every callus on her palms, every scar that told her story. Sarah cried again, but this time from joy, from the overwhelming relief of being seen completely and loved anyway. "Your hands are perfect," James whispered against her palm, kissing each finger. "Everything about you is perfect." Sarah believed him. The first year of their marriage brought challenges that tested them both. A harsh winter killed 3 head of cattle, and a spring flood damaged their barn. Sarah suffered a miscarriage in February that left her grieving and weak, and James held her through the worst of it, his own sorrow evident but controlled for her sake. They rebuilt together, their partnership growing stronger with each obstacle overcome. Sarah learned to accept help without seeing it as weakness, and James learned that his wife's stubbornness was born of survival, not pride. They fought occasionally, both possessing tempers that flared hot, but they learned to argue without cruelty and to forgive without holding grudges. Money remained tight, but they were building something sustainable. James's skill with horses brought additional income from neighboring ranchers who paid for training services, and Sarah's careful management meant they never went into serious debt. They hired occasional help during busy seasons, but mostly they worked the ranch together side by side, equal partners in every way that mattered. The Double R's Herbert Reynolds eventually returned to St. Louis, selling his ranch to a Texas family named Morrison, who proved to be good neighbors. The Morrisons had a daughter, Emily, who became Sarah's first real friend in the territory. Through Emily, Sarah began to remember the parts of herself she had buried. The girl who had once played piano and loved reading and dreamed of more than just survival. James bought her books from the general store, spending money they didn't really have because he saw how she treasured them. Sarah taught him to read better, helping him stumble through newspapers and dime novels in the evenings. They built a life that was more than just work, finding moments of joy and laughter and passion amid the endless demands of the ranch. In the spring of 1883, Sarah discovered she was pregnant again. The fear was immediate and overwhelming, memories of her previous loss flooding back. James found her crying in the barn, and he simply sat beside her in the hay, holding her hand. "Whatever happens, we face it together," he said. "But I have a feeling this one's a fighter, just like their mother." Sarah leaned against his shoulder, drawing strength from his solid presence. "I'm scared." "I know, so am I." His hand pressed gently against her still flat stomach. "But we're going to get through this." Sarah's pregnancy progressed normally this time, though she never quite shook the fear that something would go wrong. James was endlessly patient with her anxiety, taking on more of the heavy work as her belly grew, never complaining about the additional burden. Emily Morrison visited frequently, her cheerful presence a balm to Sarah's nerves. The baby came on a cold November morning, arriving faster than expected. James rode desperately for the midwife in town, but Sarah's labor progressed too quickly. Emily ended up delivering the baby, a healthy boy with powerful lungs and his father's dark eyes, while Sarah screamed and pushed and prayed. When James returned with the midwife, he found his wife exhausted but triumphant, holding their son against her chest. The look on his face, pure wonder and joy and love, made every moment of fear worth it. He knelt beside the bed, touching the baby's tiny hand with one rough finger, and when his son gripped it instinctively, James's eyes filled with tears. "He's perfect," James whispered. You're perfect, both of you." They named him Matthew, after Sarah's father. The baby thrived, growing strong and healthy through that winter and into the spring. Sarah discovered a fierceness in motherhood that surprised her, a protective love that somehow coexisted with her continued dedication to the ranch. She worked with Matthew strapped to her back in a sling Emily had shown her how to make, and James built a cradle that could be moved from room to room so their son was always near. The ranch prospered slowly but steadily. By 1885, they had doubled their herd and purchased an additional 40 acres from a retiring rancher to the south. James's reputation as a horse trainer had spread, and they now commanded premium prices for their services. Sarah kept meticulous books, her careful management ensuring they always had reserves for hard times. Matthew grew into a curious, energetic toddler who followed his father everywhere, mimicking James's walk and his quiet way of speaking. Sarah watched them together, her heart so full it sometimes felt like it might burst. This life, this family, had seemed impossible just a few years ago, and yet here it was, solid and real and hers. A daughter arrived in 1886, born during a summer thunderstorm that seemed to match her temperament. They named her Catherine, and from the moment she could toddle, she was racing after her brother, determined to keep up. Catherine had Sarah's stubborn chin and James's dark eyes, and she was fearless in a way that gave both her parents equal amounts of pride and terror. The children grew up learning the ranch, understanding from their earliest memories that their family's survival depended on hard work and careful stewardship of the land. Matthew was gentle with the animals, while Catherine showed her mother's head for numbers and organization. They fought like wildcats and loved each other fiercely, and Sarah saw her own resilience reflected in both of them. The territory changed around them. Silver City grew larger, gaining a proper school and a telegraph office. The railroad pushed closer, bringing both opportunities and challenges. More settlers arrived, fencing off the open range, and the wild days of the frontier began to fade into memory and legend. Sarah was 30 years old in 1891. No longer the desperate girl who had clawed her way to survival. Her hands were still rough, still calloused, but now James kissed them regularly, a gesture that had become ritual between them. Every time Sarah expressed doubt or insecurity, he would take her hands in his and kiss each palm, reminding her without words of his love and her worth. They celebrated their 10th anniversary with a rare trip to Albuquerque, leaving the children with Emily Morrison and her husband. Sarah wore a dress James had commissioned from a seamstress, fine fabric that felt strange against her work-hardened body. But when James looked at her, she saw herself through his eyes, beautiful, strong, desired. They stayed in a hotel, a luxury beyond their usual means, and made love in a real bed with clean sheets and privacy. James traced the scars on Sarah's hands, kissing each one, whispering how much he loved her, how grateful he was for every day they had together. Sarah cried, as she sometimes still did, overwhelmed by the impossible gift of being loved so completely. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked in the darkness, her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Giving up a foreman's job for this life?" James's arms tightened around her. "Not for a single moment. Everything I have worth having came from that choice. You, our children, our home. Why would I regret finding everything I'd ever wanted?" Sarah tilted her face up to kiss him, pouring into it all the love and gratitude she couldn't find words for. They made love again. Slower this time. A reaffirmation of vows spoken 10 years ago and lived every day since. The ranch continued to grow. By 1895, they employed 2 full-time hands and seasonal workers during busy periods. Matthew, now 12, was already showing the makings of a fine horseman, while 9-year-old Catherine had announced her intention to become a veterinarian, a profession she had read about in one of her mother's treasured books. James and Sarah encouraged both children, determined that their son and daughter would have choices they themselves had never enjoyed. Another son arrived unexpectedly in 1896, a late surprise that Sarah approached with more confidence than fear. Thomas was born in April, a quiet baby who seemed content to observe the world with solemn eyes. Catherine immediately appointed herself his protector, and Matthew built him toys with touching dedication. Sarah's body bore the marks of childbearing and hard work, her hands rougher than ever, her face lined by sun and worry and laughter. But James still looked at her with the same intensity he had shown that first day at the courthouse, and his desire for her had never waned. He still kissed her work-roughened palms, still whispered that she was beautiful, and Sarah had finally learned to believe him. The new century arrived with celebration and uncertainty. The Wild West of Sarah's youth was largely gone, replaced by fences and laws and the steady march of civilization. But here on their ranch, carved from hardship and watered with tears and sweat and love, they had built something that would endure. Matthew married at 20, choosing a rancher's daughter from a neighboring county who shared his gentle nature and love of horses. The wedding was held at Sarah and James's ranch, a joyous affair that brought together friends and neighbors from across the territory. Sarah cried as she watched her son pledge his life to another, remembering her own wedding day and feeling the swift passage of time like a physical ache. Catherine left for veterinary school in Chicago in 1903, the first woman in the family to pursue higher education. Sarah worried constantly, but James reminded her that their daughter possessed the same strength and determination that had allowed Sarah herself to survive. Catherine wrote long letters home, full of excitement about her studies and the vast world beyond New Mexico that she was discovering. Thomas grew into a thoughtful, studious boy who loved books as much as his mother did. He talked of becoming a lawyer, of using education to help ranchers like his parents navigate the increasingly complex legal landscape of the new century. James and Sarah saved carefully for his education, determined that their youngest would have every opportunity. In 1905, Sarah turned 44, and James threw her a birthday celebration that brought together their entire community. Friends from decades past mixed with newer acquaintances, all gathered to honor the woman who had become a pillar of the Silver City community. Sarah, overwhelmed and touched, stood on her porch and looked out at the faces assembled before her, her rough hand clasped tightly in James's. "I can't believe this is my life," she whispered to him. "Believe it," James whispered back, kissing her temple. "You built it. You earned it." That night, alone in their bedroom in the house they had shared for over 20 years, James made love to his wife with the same passion and tenderness he had always shown. Afterward, holding Sarah in his arms, he took her hands in his and kissed each palm, a gesture so familiar now that Sarah smiled even before he spoke. "Still the most beautiful hands I've ever known," James said quietly. "They show exactly who you are, and I fall in love with you all over again every time I see them." Sarah touched his face, her calloused fingers tracing the lines that time had etched there. "I love you. I don't say it enough, but I love you more than I ever thought it was possible to love anyone." "I know," James said simply. "I feel it every day." Matthew and his wife presented them with their first grandchild in 1906, a robust boy they named James after his grandfather. Holding his namesake, James Cordell felt the circle of life complete itself in a way that brought tears to his weathered eyes. Sarah stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder, her own eyes wet as she watched her husband cradle their grandson. Catherine returned home after completing her studies, one of only a handful of female veterinarians in the country. She set up practice in Silver City and within months had proven herself as skilled as any male counterpart. She remained unmarried, declaring herself too busy and too committed to her work for domestic life, and Sarah saw an echo of her younger self in her daughter's fierce independence. Thomas departed for law school in 1908, his parents' pride evident in every letter they wrote him. The ranch, now prosperous and well-established, could easily afford his education. Matthew had taken over most of the daily operations, and James, now in his early 50s, was content to step back and advise rather than lead. The years passed with the comfortable rhythm of a life well lived. More grandchildren arrived, filling the house with noise and laughter. Sarah taught her granddaughters to read and to stand up for themselves, while James taught his grandsons about horses and integrity and the importance of keeping your word. Together they passed on the lessons they had learned through hardship and love. In 1912, on a warm spring evening, Sarah and James sat on their porch as they had done countless times over the past 30 years. They were both graying now, their bodies marked by age and hard work, but their love had only deepened with time. James held Sarah's hand, his thumb tracing the familiar calluses and scars. "Do you remember that first day?" Sarah asked, "and when you found me trying to free that steer?" "I remember thinking you were the most stubborn woman I'd ever met," James said with a smile, "and the most impressive." "I thought you were presumptuous," Sarah admitted, "coming onto my land and telling me what to do." "It was my land," James teased, and Sarah swatted his arm. "It was not." They sat in companionable silence, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. Their children were settled, their grandchildren thriving, their ranch prosperous. The life they had built together stood as testament to what two determined people could accomplish with love and hard work. "I'm glad you disagreed," Sarah said softly. James looked at her, confusion flickering across his face. "About what?" "About my hands." Sarah lifted their joined hands, studying the way his fingers intertwined with hers. Both sets of hands were marked by work, scarred and calloused, honest hands that had built this life together. "When I said they were too rough for a lady, you disagreed. You kissed them and told me they were beautiful. You changed everything in that moment." James brought her hand to his lips, kissing her palm in the gesture that had become their private language of love. "I didn't disagree because I was being kind. I disagreed because it was the truth. Your hands are beautiful because they're yours, because they show the strength and determination that makes you who you are. I've never stopped believing that." Sarah leaned against her husband's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the absolute security of being loved completely. "I never thought I could have this. A family, a home, someone who loved me not despite who I am, but because of it." "I'm the lucky one," James said, his arm coming around her shoulders. "I was drifting, going nowhere, until I found you. You gave me a purpose, a home, a reason to stay in one place. You gave me everything." They sat together as darkness fell, two people who had found each other against the odds and built something remarkable from dust and determination and love. The ranch spread around them, prosperous and peaceful, a legacy they would pass to their children and grandchildren. The rough hands that had worked this land, that had struggled and fought and ultimately triumphed, remained clasped together as the stars emerged overhead. Inside the house, Sarah could hear the sounds of their family gathering for dinner, Matthew's family staying for the evening meal, laughter and conversation drifting through the open windows. This was home, built from nothing by two people who had refused to give up on the land or on each other. "I love you," Sarah said, the words as easy now as breathing. "I love you too," James replied, kissing her once more. Rough hands and all. Sarah smiled, her heart full to bursting with gratitude and joy. The girl who had watched her father die on a dusty road, who had hardened herself to survive, who had believed she would always be alone, had found instead a love that transformed her life completely. The cowboy who had drifted from place to place seeking something he couldn't name had discovered it in a stubborn woman with calloused hands and a fierce determination to survive. Together they had built not just a ranch, but a life, not just a marriage, but a partnership that had weathered every storm. Their love story was written in the scars on their hands, in the land they had fought for, in the children and grandchildren who carried their legacy forward. It was a love born of the Wild West, tested by hardship and proven true by time. As the last light faded from the sky and the stars blazed overhead in the vast New Mexico darkness, Sarah McKenna Cordell sat with her husband of 31 years, their rough hands clasped together, and knew without doubt that she had found everything she had ever needed. The hands she had once thought too rough for love had been cherished, worshipped, and kissed thousands of times by the man who had taught her that strength and femininity were not opposites but complementary parts of the same remarkable whole. Their story, born in dust and struggle, had blossomed into something beautiful and enduring. And every day, in big ways and small, James Cordell continued to disagree with any suggestion that his wife was anything less than perfect, kissing her work-roughened palms and proving with every touch that real love sees beauty where others see only hardship. The ranch stood as their monument, the family they had created their legacy, and the love between them the foundation upon which everything else was built. In the end, Sarah's rough hands had built not just a life, but an empire of love, and that was worth more than all the softness in the world.